I have tried, on 3 separate occasions since coming home, to write a report about what happened on Velkreth. Each time I got as far as the second page before I stopped. Not because I couldn't remember. I remember everything. I stopped because a report implies an institution to receive it, and the institution that sent us there no longer acknowledges the mission existed. The 6 of us were never officially on that planet. The transport logs were amended. The Council's invitation was redacted down to a single line in a procurement ledger. Something about biological exchange, and even that was stamped with a classification tier I don't have clearance to read. So I'm writing this instead, not a report, not a deposition. Just what happened, as close to true as I can hold it. Starting from the morning we boarded the transit carrier at Meridian Station, and ending with the morning I came back alone. There were 6 of us. I was the middle one in seniority, which put me in the middle of most decisions, which is a position I have spent my career trying to avoid. Dr. Fen Zolari was the senior physician, a woman in her late 50s who had spent 20 years working trauma response in the outer colonies. She had gray-streaked hair she kept pinned back, and a voice like gravel in a tin drum. She was the one the Council had specifically requested, and she was the one who had specifically requested the rest of us. I still don't know entirely why she chose me. When I asked her, she said she needed people who could operate in environments where the standard equipment didn't work. I had spent 4 years on the ice worlds of the Keldron Shelf doing exactly that. So I suppose I was the obvious choice for a mission to an ice world. I didn't know at the time how specifically that qualification would matter. The others, Dr. Pura Ohanu, 31, the youngest among us, a specialist in xenobiological compatibility and the one most comfortable talking to aliens. Dr. Sergei Vorokin, 48, former military trauma surgeon, the one who never laughed at jokes but always seemed faintly amused. Dr. Alana Croft, late 40s, epidemiologist, the one who asked the most questions and wrote everything down. And Dr. Mahas, 55, the quiet one, the one who had been on more first-contact medical missions than the rest of us combined, who said almost nothing on the 6-day transit and spent most of it staring out the port window with a thermos of something that wasn't coffee. 6 doctors. A medical envoy, the Council had called it. A gesture of goodwill toward the Galactic Union. Proof that humanity was willing to share its expertise, its knowledge, its willingness to heal. We were going to Velkreth, which was what the Council's translating apparatus rendered the planet's name as, though Torben told me on the 2nd day of transit that the translation was approximate, and the real name was something closer to the sound ice makes when a glacier shifts in the dark. He said it without particular drama. He just said it and went back to his thermos. Velkreth was a metropolitan world. That was the first thing that surprised me, and I don't know why it surprised me, because I'd read the briefing documents. Reading and seeing are different things. Came out of the approach corridor, and the planet was below us, mostly white. And I thought glacier, ice shelf, Arctic waste. And then we dropped lower, and I realized the white I was seeing was buildings, spires of compressed ice crystal and pale stone, thousands of them, rising in tiers from a vast central basin that the locals used as their main civic plaza. The city wasn't built on the ice. The city was built from it. Every structure had been grown. In some architectural process I never fully understood, from the same crystalline material the planet's crust was made of. The effect from above was of a chandelier the size of a continent. The transit carrier set us down on a receiving platform on the city's upper tier, and the cold hit me before the ramp had fully extended. Not the cold of an open polar region, which has a quality of exposure to it, a sense of wind and distance. This was the cold of a sealed vault, still pressurized, the kind of cold that has been sitting in place for a very long time. Fen was already pulling on her thermal layer when I stepped out beside her. She didn't comment on the temperature. She just buttoned the collar and looked at the city and said quietly that it was beautiful. It was. I won't pretend otherwise. Whatever was waiting for us inside it, Velkreth was one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen. Our liaison met us on the platform. His name translated was something like the one who speaks between, though he told Pyrrha we could call him Adran if that was easier, and it was. He was tall, narrow through the chest in the way many of the Velcrethian people were, with the pale luminescent skin and the large dark eyes and the slow deliberate way of moving that I'd come to understand, over the next 2 days, wasn't caution but simply the natural pace of a species that had evolved in a very cold environment, where moving fast was dangerous. He wore layered robes in a gray-blue that matched the city's upper stones almost exactly. He was courteous. He showed us to our quarters, which were deep in the mid-tier of the city, warm enough to be habitable for us, furnished with something approximate to beds, and a workspace and a long curved table where we could lay out equipment. He explained the mission clearly. The Velcrethian medical establishment had encountered a condition they didn't understand. It was affecting their elder population, a neurological failure that produced a loss of deep memory, then language, then motor function. They had cataloged it. They had studied it. They had not been able to treat it, and they had decided, after considerable internal debate, to invite outside expertise. That outside expertise was us. It was a straightforward diagnostic mission, 2 weeks, possibly 3. We would examine a cohort of affected patients, share our findings with the local medical authorities, suggest treatment frameworks, and return automatic credit for humanity. Goodwill in the ledger. Nothing unusual. Adrian showed us the first of the patient files that afternoon. Fen sat at the curved table with Alana beside her, going through the documents, while Pira handled the xenobiological baseline work, and Torben and Sergei set up the diagnostic equipment. I was doing inventory, which was as unglamorous as it sounds, when Alana called me over to look at something in one of the scans. The lesion pattern was unlike anything I had seen. I told her that honestly. She nodded slowly, made a note, and asked Fen what she thought. Fen said it reminded her very distantly of a prion cascade she'd worked in the outer colonies. But the distribution was wrong, too regular, almost as if the damage had been applied rather than grown. She used that word. Applied. None of us said anything to it at the time. We went back to work. First full day passed without incident. Adren brought us to the medical complex in the morning, introduced us to the Velcrethian physicians we'd be working alongside, translated when the automatic systems couldn't keep pace, and returned us to our quarters in the evening. The local doctors were reserved, but professionally respectful. The patients were quiet, in the way of people who have forgotten what they wanted to say. It was difficult, controlled work, and by the end of the first day I was tired in the way that I only get tired when a case is already pulling at me. The second day was similar. We made progress. Pira had found 3 biomarkers in the affected tissue that she was almost certain were environmental in origin, which meant exposure to something rather than a naturally occurring pathology. She was careful not to say it that way in the joint session with the Velcrethian doctors. Fen had told her before we went in to keep the language neutral, but she said it to us at dinner, and there was a long silence after. If the damage was environmental. If something in Velcreth itself was doing this to its own elderly population, that was a different kind of problem than the one we'd been invited to solve. Torben went to bed early that night. He didn't say much. He hadn't said much either day, but there was a quality to his quiet on the second evening that was different from the transit quiet. When Sergei asked him if everything was all right, Torben said that the city felt watchful to him. Sergei asked what that meant. Torben said he wasn't sure. He went to bed. I woke in the night because it was very quiet. That requires explanation. The quarters they'd given us were in the mid-tier, which meant we were surrounded by the normal acoustic signature of a living city. Ventilation systems, the low crystalline resonance that the buildings produced as they contracted and expanded with temperature shifts, distant movement in the corridors. It was never silent. I had acclimatized to that ambient sound over 2 days without realizing I'd done it, the way you acclimatize to the noise of a ship on a long transit. When I woke, all of it was gone, not quiet in the sense of reduced gone, as if something had stepped on the city's throat. I lay still and listened for approximately 30 seconds. Then I got up and knocked on Fenne's door. She answered immediately, which meant she hadn't been asleep. She was already dressed, which meant she'd been awake for a while. She looked at me, and then passed me into the corridor, and I said nothing for a moment. Then she said we should check on the others. Pira was asleep. Fruit. We could hear her breathing through the door and decided not to wake her. Elana was awake, sitting at her workspace with a tablet, making notes, and she looked up when we knocked and said she'd heard it too. Sergei answered his door already in boots and jacket, which told me he'd been ready to move for some time. Torben's door was open. Torben was not in his room. We found him in the common area at the end of our corridor, standing at the large viewport that looked out over the city's mid-tier plaza. He was standing very still, which was normal for him, but his hands were flat against the glass, which was not. He didn't look at us when we came in. He said, without turning, that there was something moving in the plaza below. I went to the viewport. Plaza was lit by the city's ambient system, a soft blue-gray glow that came from the crystal itself, phosphorescent in the cold. The plaza was empty, wide, pale empty. I told him I didn't see anything. He said to keep looking. And because it was Torben, and because of the quality of his voice, I kept looking. Something moved in the far corner of the plaza, near one of the archways that led to the lower tier. It moved once, a single lateral motion, and then it was still. At that distance and in that light, it could have been anything. A maintenance drone, a Velcrethian citizen out late, the shadow of something, passing one of the upper-level light sources. Torben said he'd been watching it for 40 minutes. He said it had been getting closer, but slowly, and it never moved when he looked directly at it. Only in his peripheral vision, only when he was focused somewhere else. I am a physician. I spent 12 years before joining the diplomatic corps as a general practitioner and trauma specialist. I am trained, professionally and temperamentally, toward rational explanations. I stood at that viewport and looked at the empty plaza, and I told Torben, carefully, that he was tired, that the ice world environment produced certain visual artifacts under artificial light that could read his movement, and that he should try to get some sleep. He turned and looked at me then. His eyes were steady. He wasn't frightened. Torben Huss, I would come to understand, was not constitutionally capable of fear, in the conventional sense. He simply observed things and recorded them. He said that I was probably right, and that he hoped I was right, and that he was going to stay at the viewport a while longer regardless. We left him there. In the morning, he was gone. Not gone from the viewport. Gone from the quarters entirely. His room was empty. His gear still there. His thermos on the workspace beside a tablet with a single note on it. The note said, "The sound stopped because something is listening to it. Be careful with the doors." We reported his absence to Adrian, who was distressed in the controlled way of someone who has been trained not to show distress, and who is failing. He said he would alert the civic safety authorities. He said Velcreth was a safe world. He said these things carefully, with the deliberate pace of someone choosing words from a very short list. Fen told him we needed to know if there was anything in the city's lower levels that could harm a human. She asked directly, without preamble. Adren was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. He said that there were areas of the lower tier that were not currently in active use, and that some of those areas had been sealed because of structural irregularities in the crystal substrate, and that civic safety had asked residents to avoid them. He said this and then said nothing else. Fen thanked him. When he left, she turned to us and said that she wanted the equipment packed and staged near the exit to our quarters before the end of the day. She said it quietly, without drama, in the tone she used when she had already made a decision. Nobody argued. Went to the medical complex for the morning session, because leaving the mission would require explanations we weren't ready to give yet. And because Fen said that whatever was happening, the patients were not responsible for it. So we went and we worked, and Pira had further findings on the biomarkers. And Alana made her notes, and Sergei ran his scans with the precise efficiency he brought to everything. And all day I kept looking at the door. We were back in our quarters by early afternoon. Finn said she was going to try to contact the transit carrier on the secure channel and arrange an early departure. She went to do that. 15 minutes later, Fen came back into the common area. She sat down. She said the carrier had responded, but the voice on the channel had not been the carrier's communications officer. She said she knew this because she had worked with that officer on 2 previous diplomatic transits, and she knew his cadence, his vocabulary, his particular way of saying acknowledgement before he confirmed a message. The voice on the channel had used the right words in the wrong order. She said it 3 times in slightly different ways, as if she was trying to be fair to the possibility that she was wrong. Then she stopped saying it and sat quietly. I asked what the voice had said. She said it had told her the departure window was closed and would reopen in 6 days as scheduled. She said it had used the word reopen rather than the word open, as if it knew there had already been an attempt to leave. Ilana asked if Torben could be on the carrier. Sergei said no, because the carrier was in dock formation, automated hold, not crewed for live communication. He said it so flatly, and with such certainty that none of us asked a follow-up question. We found Torben that evening. We found what had been Torben. Pyrrha found him first. She'd gone to the lower access corridor to check on the equipment we'd staged there. And she came back running, which was not like Pyrrha. And when she came through the door, she said his name and couldn't finish the sentence. Sergei went back with her. I stayed with Alana and Fen. When Sergei came back, he was very pale. He said that the injuries were consistent with an organism that hunted by compression, that applied force from multiple directions simultaneously, and that the cold in the corridor was approximately 40 degrees below the ambient temperature of the rest of the floor. He also said that the face was not Torben's anymore. He stopped after that. He sat down and stopped talking, and I did not push him to continue. That night, none of us slept. We sat in the common area with the lights at full and the door sealed, and Sergei's portable med scanner running a continuous perimeter sweep of the temperature in the corridor outside. Talked about what we knew, which was very little. An entity of some kind. Something that hunted in the cold. Something that had been in the lower levels. Something that was now apparently in the mid-tier. Ilana had her notebook out. She always thought better when she was writing. She said that Pyrrha's biomarker findings, the environmental contamination causing the neurological damage in the elder population, might not be pollution, might not be random, might be a byproduct of something the city itself was producing in response to a presence in its substrate. The way a body produces a fever in response to infection. She said it slowly, giving each word space, watching us to see if it was too far. It wasn't. The next 2 days were the worst, and I will tell them as plainly as I can, because I have no other way to do it. Pyrrha was the second. She went to use the sanitary facilities in the early morning, while the rest of us were awake and alert, which should have been safe. And she didn't come back. The room was empty when we checked. There was no body. There was a handprint on the far wall, at an angle that made no sense if a person standing normally had put it there. There was cold radiating from the floor. That was all. The thing that took Pyrrha's place appeared in the common area 6 hours later. I need to be precise about this because it is important. It looked exactly like Pyrrha. It had her face, her voice, her way of standing with her weight slightly shifted to the left. It used her vocabulary. It used her specific technical terminology from our diagnostic work. When Ilana asked it, carefully, neutrally, as if she was conducting an intake assessment, about the biomarker findings, it gave an answer that was accurate to within a margin of error that would have satisfied anyone who hadn't spent 3 days in a room with the real Pyrrha. Fen noticed first. She noticed because the thing did not blink at the normal rate. She told me this afterward. She said that humans blink on average 15 to 20 times per minute, and that the frequency is modulated by cognitive load and emotional state, and that the thing wearing Pyrrha's face was blinking approximately every 40 seconds in a pattern that suggested a system cycling through an approximation rather than a lived reflex. She noticed and said nothing and let it stay and watched it. We lost Ilana because of a mistake I made. The thing had been Pyrrha for approximately 12 minutes. In those minutes, 12 once, I answered one of its questions about where we'd stored the diagnostic logs. When Ilana went to retrieve those logs, something was waiting in the storage alcove that had known exactly where she was going. I heard her voice once, very short, and then silence. I have not forgiven myself for the 12 minutes. I do not expect to. After Ilana, the thing stopped pretending to be Pyrrha. I don't know if it had achieved what it needed, or if it simply didn't need the performance anymore. It left. The temperature in the room dropped for approximately 3 minutes, and then came back up. We were 4. Me, Fen, Sergey, and the equipment we'd staged and not yet used. Sergey sat at the table and said, very methodically, that he wanted to list what they knew about the organism. Fen sat across from him. I stood because I couldn't sit. Sergey listed what he knew. It was cold-sourced, meaning it operated from and left traces of extreme cold, physically alter its appearance, to replicate a human being, with enough fidelity to fool an observer for up to 12 minutes. It had killed Torben and Pyrrha in different ways, the first by compression, the second with no evidence left behind, suggesting it could adapt its method. It appeared to use information as a weapon, targeting the group by exploiting what each victim knew about the others. He paused and then said, it had been in the lower levels. The lower levels were sealed because of structural irregularities in the crystal substrate. He looked at his scanner. He said, the bioelectric signature he was reading in the walls of the building around us was consistent with a living substrate responding to a foreign presence, the same electric pattern you'd see in the tissue around an embedded pathogen, he said. The city itself is trying to contain it. The city sealed the lower tiers because the organism was there, and the city knew it. The city produced the acoustic silence we heard on the first night because it was holding itself still, the way prey holds still. Fen said. Then something let it out. We looked at each other. There was nothing to say to that, so nobody said anything. The next several hours were very quiet. Sergey ran his scanner continuously. Fen went through everything we had on the organism from the diagnostic work, the scans from the patient files, looking for anything that would tell us what it was or where it had come from. Checked the equipment staging and the exit corridor and came back and checked it again and came back and checked the door seal and came back. I was not behaving efficiently. I knew that. I kept moving. Because if I stopped, I would have to be still with the knowledge that Alana and Torben and Pyrrha were dead, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. At some point in the late evening, Fen looked up from the files and said, the neurological damage in the elder population begins with memory loss. She said it again slowly. Memory loss, then language, then motor function. She said the affected elders had all lived in the city for more than 40 years. She said that the affected regions showed the highest concentration of the biomarkers Pyrrha had identified as environmental. She said that when she mapped the affected regions against a structural plan of the city she'd pulled from the civic system, every single one of them was directly above the sealed lower-tier areas. She said, it doesn't just kill, it feeds. Neurological damage is a byproduct of extended proximity to something that feeds on cognitive function. The elder population weren't getting sick. They were being slowly consumed through the walls. Sergey said, how long has it been down there? Fen said, a very long time. The thing came back for Sergey at 300. He was awake and his scanner was running. And he saw the temperature drop before it reached the door. He had exactly enough time to say my name and then the door opened from the outside. Through a sealed door, a sealed and bolted door, and the cold came in like a tide. I was across the room. I had been awake, but I was not fast enough. What I was fast enough to do was get to the equipment cases and get a thermal disruptor into my hands. Thermal disruptors are not weapons. They are medical tools, used to rapidly alter the temperature gradient of a tissue site during certain surgical procedures. They are not designed to be pointed at an enemy. I pointed one at the cold and activated it at maximum output. The sound it made when the heat hit it was not a scream. I don't have a word for what it was. Low and resonant, like a frequency the ice itself was generating, like the sound the glacier makes when it shifts. The temperature in the room went from 40 below to 40 above in approximately 2 seconds, and the thing was gone, not fled, but simply ceased to be present in that space. And Sergey was still standing. Sergey stood very still for a moment. Then he sat down on the floor. He looked at his hands. He said, it doesn't expect that. I asked what he meant. He said, it reads surrender. That's how it knows when to take someone. Torben went still at the viewport, watching it, and it read that as a decision. Pyrrha went alone in the dark when she was frightened, and it read that as vulnerability. Ilana went toward information because she trusted information, and it read that as a vector. He paused. He said, it can't read aggression in a medical context, because that's not a state that makes sense to it. It's never encountered a thing that uses healing tools as weapons. I stood with the thermal disruptor still in my hand and thought about what he was saying. I am a doctor. I have spent my professional life refusing to let people die when there is any option remaining. Refusal is not calm. It is not measured. It is a specific kind of fury that most people mistake for competence because it wears the same face. Every time I've kept someone alive who should have been dead, it came from that place. Not from skill. From the inability to accept that the answer was already written. And get to the staging area if I keep moving. He said, yes. I said, then let's go. We moved through the building with both thermal disruptors, running. I will tell you what that was like. It was like walking a perimeter in complete darkness, knowing that something was in the dark with you, and having only your noise and your heat to push it back. The cold came at us 3 more times in the corridors. Each time I activated the disruptors before it reached us. Each time the frequency sound came and the cold receded. I didn't think about Alana in the storage alcove. I didn't think about Torben's face being wrong. I thought about the next 10 meters of corridor and the location of my instruments, and where Sergei was relative to me, and nothing else. We reached the staging area. Fen was there. She had been there for approximately 2 hours. When we came through the door, she looked at us with an expression that was not relief exactly, more like a person completing a count and finding the number they expected rather than the number they feared. She said she'd had a visit from something wearing Alana's voice, and she'd asked it a question only. Alana would know the answer to. A specific case from a paper they'd published together before the mission. A methodological detail that was never in the final version, and that Alana had told her about over a shared meal 6 months ago. The thing hadn't known the answer. It had tried to construct one. Fen had activated the disruptor, and it had left, and she had finished staging the equipment and sat down and waited. I asked her how she'd known to bring a disruptor. She said, I'm a trauma physician. I have been going into hostile environments for 30 years. I bring everything. 3 of us together in the staging area. The exit corridor 10 meters away. The carrier 6 days out. Fen said, we weren't leaving in 6 days, because 6 days was enough time for the organism to take us one by one in the corridor, and because the thing on the carrier channel would have already reported to whatever was controlling access to the dock. She said we needed to make enough noise that someone had to respond. I asked what kind of noise. She said, the city is a living system that has been trying to contain this organism for a very long time. We are going to help it. The thermal disruptors ran at maximum sustained output for 11 hours. We moved through the lower corridor of the accessible tier, below the staging area, and we heated every wall surface we could reach. I don't know enough about the city's biology to tell you exactly what we triggered. I know that the crystal substrate began to resonate at increasing frequency as the temperature in those spaces rose. I know that the resonance traveled upward through the building's structure and out through the upper tier and across the plaza. I know that at some point in the 3rd hour, the civic system, whatever intelligence governs Velkreth's infrastructure, joined what we were doing. Lights in the sealed lower levels came on for the first time in what I later learned was over 300 years. The ventilation systems in the sealed areas reactivated. The temperature in every sealed space on Velkreth rose simultaneously. The organism needed the cold, not preferred. Needed. It existed within a temperature band that the city had been unable to warm, because the city was also inhabited by beings who required cold to survive, and warming one area would have harmed the population in adjacent spaces. 3 humans with thermal disruptors, and a specific and total refusal to stop had no such constraint. We didn't care about the cold. We were already miserable. We kept going. The sound it made when the city expelled it, and expelled is the right word. The city expelled it the way a body expels a pathogen, once the immune response finally has enough leverage, was the same frequency sound from the corridor, but amplified across an entire metropolitan grid. Crystal buildings rang with it. The plaza resonated. I felt it in the bones of my chest. It lasted for approximately 40 seconds, and then it was gone. The city went very quiet again for a different reason. Not the held breath quiet of prey. The settled quiet of a space that has stopped fighting something. Adrian found us in the corridor. He was accompanied by 4 civic safety officers, and he looked, for the first time since we'd arrived, genuinely at a loss for how to compose his face. He asked, in the translating system's approximation of his language, what had happened. Fen told him. She told him all of it, including the 3 colleagues we had lost, in a voice that did not waver. When she described the thing in the lower levels, the colonial term she used, a consuming pathogen in the city's substrate, Adrian went very still in the way Torben had been still at the viewport. And I wondered for a moment if I should be alarmed. But it was not the stillness of paralysis. It was the stillness of a person receiving a truth they have been afraid to hear for a very long time, he said. We have called it many things over the centuries. We thought it was contained, Fen said. It wasn't, he said. You drove it out, she said. We helped your city drive it out. Your city has been trying to do it alone for 300 years. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, we did not know your kind could do this, Fenta said. That's all right. We didn't know your kind needed us to. We were taken to the upper tier. Our colleagues' remains were recovered. What could be recovered? And treated with the respect the Velcrethian people reserved for the honored dead of a conflict, which was a form of recognition I could not have anticipated, and which meant more to me than I know how to say. The transit carrier was diverted from Dockhold. We were given transport home in 4 days rather than 6. I went back to our quarters once to collect the gear and the diagnostic files. I stood in Torben's room for a few minutes looking at the thermos on the workspace. I took it with me. I don't know why I took it. It seemed wrong to leave it behind. The report I filed when I returned is not the one I described at the beginning of this account. The one I filed went through channels, was redacted, was classified, was amended down to a procurement line. That's all right. I understand why. The politics of what happened on Velcreth, the fact that the Council had an organism consuming its elder population for 3 centuries and had not disclosed it to us before the mission, those are not my problems to solve. I am a physician. My problems are the ones in front of me. What I want to say and what I have written this account to say is this. Torben Haas and Pira Ohanu and Elana Croft went to Velcreth as healers, representing our species in good faith. And they died on an alien world in the service of that representation. They deserve to be named. They deserve to be remembered. They were not assets in a diplomatic transaction. They were doctors, trained to go toward harm rather than away from it, and they went. And the thing that survived, the thing that drove a centuries-old consuming entity from a living city's walls, was not a weapon system. It was not a warship, or a diplomatic ultimatum, or a political maneuver. It was 3 doctors with surgical instruments and the professional inability to accept that the situation was hopeless. We need all of us, to our training, understand that hopelessness is a clinical state and not a fact. We are trained to keep going past the point where the statistics would suggest we stop. And I have read everything the Velcrethian authorities shared with us afterward, and I still do not fully understand what it was. It had been operating on a world where all the beings it encountered eventually reached the point of exhaustion. That's what it fed on. Not just cognition. The moment when cognition gives up. The moment when a person or a system finally decides that the cost of continuing is greater than the cost of stopping. It had never met a species that trained for that moment, that rehearsed for it, that built an entire profession around the act of refusing it. Fen went back to the outer colony trauma circuit 3 months after we returned. I heard she was on a station near the Keldron Shelf, which is cold and difficult, and exactly where she belongs. Sergei went back to surgical practice. He works trauma at the Meridian Hub now, long hours, exactly as before. Torben's thermos, it sits on my desk. Whatever was in it smelled like nothing I can identify. And when I tried the residue, it tasted like pine and metal and something warm I don't have a name for. He watched something move across the plaza in the dark, and he stayed at the window and reported what he saw, and never once suggested that we run. That was Torben Haas. That was the kind of doctor he was. The ice world is quiet now. The city's elder population, the ones still living, have begun to recover. The neurological damage is not fully reversible in the advanced cases. But the progression has stopped, and some of the earlier stage patients have shown marked improvement. The city's substrate is healing. Velcreth is learning what it is like to exist without something feeding on it in the dark. I think about that sometimes. I think about what it means to have been host to a thing like that for 300 years, and to not even know for certain that it was there. Only to feel the slow erosion of your oldest people and have no explanation for it. And then I think about 3 humans with medical equipment standing in a cold corridor, deciding that today was not the day. And I think that maybe that is, in the end, what we are. Not the species with the biggest ships, not the species with the most territory, or the longest history, or the most elaborate political structures. The species that looks at the dark and says, not today, not this one, not while I'm still standing. It's not much of an epitaph for a planet, but it's ours, and it held.